She was 15 years old. She stood 5 feet tall in a dress her mother had sewn, and she was about to walk onto a line cut in a Cincinnati field to shoot against a professional marksman who had never lost a match. Nobody had told him the best shot in the country lived on a poor farm in Darke County, Ohio, and that her name was Phoebe Ann. What would you have done at 15, with a whole hall of strangers watching you lift your father's old rifle? What do you do when a life of hunger and cold has taught you one thing only, that you can hit what you aim at, and suddenly that one thing is all you have? This is the story of the girl who walked onto that line, and it is the story of everything that came after. Welcome back to Western Pioneer Archives. If you love the true stories of the American frontier, the ones behind the legends, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And while you watch, think on this and let us know in the comments. What do you believe it takes to turn poverty into power when the world has already written you off? Now, let us begin. To understand how a half-starved Quaker farm girl from the Ohio backcountry became, for a time, the most famous woman in the world, we have to begin with the land that made her and the century she was born into. Darke County sits in the western edge of Ohio, along the Indiana line. It is flat, wooded country, drained by slow creeks that freeze hard in winter and flood in spring. In the middle of the 19th century, the land was still raw. The federal government had only removed the Shawnee and the Miami a generation earlier. The forests were mixed hardwood, oak and hickory and walnut, and they were full of game. Squirrel, rabbit, quail, grouse, pheasant, wild turkey, and white-tailed deer moved through the understory in numbers that a modern hunter would scarcely believe. It was good ground for a family that knew how to work it. It was also hard ground for a family that lost its footing. Phoebe Ann Mosey was born on August 13, 1860, in a log cabin less than 2 miles northwest of Woodland, now called Willow Dell, in Patterson Township, Darke County. Her parents were Quakers, Friends, as they called themselves, of English descent from Hollidaysburg in Blair County, Pennsylvania. Her mother was Susan, born in 1830, whose maiden name was Wise. Her father was Jacob Mosey, born in 1799, which meant that when Phoebe Ann came into the world, her father was already 61 years old, a veteran of the War of 1812, a man who had already lived a long life and who was about to run out of years. The family's name was a puzzle even in its own time. It appears variously in the historical record as Moses, Mawsey, Mosey, Mosey, and Mosey. The 1860 census taker wrote it as Mawsey, which is considered an error. The 1870 census listed young Annie as Ann Mosey. The spelling Mosey is the version engraved on Jacob's headstone and in his War of 1812 military records, and it is the official spelling used by the Annie Oakley Foundation, which is maintained to this day by her living relatives. Annie herself, later in life, preferred the spelling Mosey, which put her in friendly argument with her own brother John. He went by Moses. She went by Mosey. Both of them were born to Jacob and Susan Mosey. Such were the oddities of a country still writing down its own names for the first time. Jacob and Susan had married in 1848 and moved around 1855 to a rented farm in Patterson Township, which they later purchased with a mortgage. They were not wealthy people. They were not educated people by the standards of the eastern cities. They were frontier Quakers, plain-spoken and unlettered, and they were doing what thousands of families like them were doing across the old Northwest in the middle of the 19th century, trying to make a piece of cleared land pay for itself, one hard season at a time. Annie was the 6th of 9 children and the 5th of the 7 surviving ones. Her siblings were Mary Jane, born in 1851, who would die in 1867, Lydia, born in 1852, Elizabeth, born in 1855, Sarah Ellen, born in 1857, who would live until 1939, Catherine, who was born and died in 1859, John, born in 1861, Huldah, born in 1864, and a stillborn infant brother in 1865, 9 pregnancies, 7 children who made it past infancy, 1 who would become famous in every capital of Europe. The children were raised Quaker. That meant a household without oaths, without violence, without drink. It meant plain speech and plain dress. It meant reverence for work and for silence. It meant, for Annie, a deep and lifelong instinct toward modesty and self-containment that would, later, astonish the crowned heads of the continent. She would wear her hair long and her skirts modest, even at the peak of her fame, and she would never permit herself to be photographed in a way that would have shamed her mother. That, too, came from this cabin in Darke County. And then, in the winter of 1865, the blizzard came. Jacob Mosey was out in the weather, caught in a storm that tore across the Ohio flatlands in late autumn. He fell ill from hypothermia. He lingered as a man of 65 could linger with his lungs filling. Early in 1866, he succumbed to pneumonia. He was 66 years old. His death ended the family's hold on its world. Susan was a widow with 7 living children, the youngest still a baby. The mortgage on the farm was still owed. There was no pension. There was no uncle with money. There was Quaker charity. There were neighbors. And there was work. Work in a world where a widow's labor was undervalued and her options were few. Susan took a job as a nurse when she could. The older sisters gathered nuts from the woods and picked up windfall apples. They fished the creek. They watched the little ones. They survived as such families survived. Close to the ground, closer to hunger, one bad season away from ruin. Susan remarried. Her second husband was Daniel Brumbaugh, reportedly considerably older than she was. They had a daughter named Emily, born in 1868, and then Daniel Brumbaugh died too. Susan was a widow for the second time, now with another infant. The mortgage was still owed. The winter was still coming. And this was the world that made Annie Oakley, a world in which a child had to learn, very young, that nothing would be given to her, and that anything she wanted to keep, she would have to hold with her own hands. On March 15, 1870, at the age of 9, Annie was admitted to the Darke County Infirmary, along with her older sister, Sarah Ellen. The infirmary was the county poor farm. It housed the elderly, the orphaned, the mentally ill, and the destitute. It was the last safety net in rural America before the abyss. The superintendent was a man named Samuel Crawford Eddington, and his wife Nancy taught the children there. It was Mrs. Eddington who taught Annie to sew and to decorate, skills that, decades later, would allow Annie to make her own stage costumes and trim them with her own hands. But the infirmary was only a part of the story. In the spring of 1870, Annie was bound out to a local family who had promised 50 cents a week and an education in exchange for her help caring for their infant son. They had originally wanted someone bigger, someone who could pump water and cook. They got a 9-year-old girl. For the next 2 years, Annie endured what biographers have called near slavery. The family worked her without pay. They beat her. They denied her schooling. On one occasion, the wife of the household punished Annie for falling asleep over some darning work by putting her outside in the freezing weather without her shoes. She stood in the snow until they let her back in. Annie would never name the family in her lifetime. She would never tell anyone, not even after she became the most famous woman in the country, what their real name was. She called them only the Wolves. Biographer Glenda Riley has suggested the Wolves may have been a family called Studebaker, but the 1870 census record points more directly to a family named Abram Boose of Preble County, just over the line from Darke. Whichever it was, Annie never forgave them, and never forgot them. Her silence on their name was its own kind of verdict. Around the spring of 1872, she ran. She was 11 years old. She ran from the wolves, and, according to biographer Shirl Casper, it was only at this point that she met and lived with the Eddingtons. She returned to her mother's home around the age of 15. By that time, Susan had married a third time to a man named Joseph Shaw. Even with the remarriage, the family's finances were marginal. But something had happened inside Annie during those lost years, something nobody had quite seen coming. She had learned to shoot. She had begun trapping before age 7. She had begun shooting and hunting by age 8, by her own account, with her father's old 40-inch cap-and-ball Kentucky rifle, which was taller than she was. Her first shot, as she told it later, was at a squirrel that ran through the orchard and paused on a fence rail to crack a hickory nut. Annie took the rifle from the house, aimed, and fired. She wrote, many years after, that the bullet went right through the squirrel's head from side to side. Whether this was perfectly true or tidied by memory, it was how she chose to remember the beginning. One shot, clean through, and a family with meat on the table that night. She hunted to eat, and then she hunted to sell. 2 shopkeepers in Greenville, the Katzenberger brothers, Charles and G. Anthony, bought her game and shipped it 80 miles south to hotels and restaurants in Cincinnati. They paid more for birds that had been shot through the head because the buckshot had not ruined the meat. And so, at 9, 10, 11 years old, a girl taught herself a skill that most grown men in her county could not match. She would stalk quail and pheasant in the underbrush, raise her father's old rifle, and drop them with a single shot to the skull. She did this in cold so hard it cracked the trees, and in summer so hot the birds crouched in the shade. She did it because her family was hungry, and because the Katzenberger brothers had a standing order. By the time she was 15, her shooting had paid off the $200 mortgage on her mother's farm. Think about that for a moment. A child of 15, operating with no advantage of size or strength, with no formal instruction, with a gun older than she was, had done what a widowed mother of 7 could not do, had lifted her family out of the direct path of ruin. She had done it one bird at a time. This was the girl who would be walked, not long after, onto a shooting line in Cincinnati to face Frank Butler. She did not know his name. She had never performed for a crowd. She had never been paid a dime for anything but dead quail. She had barely been to school. She had seen ugly things in the house of the wolves that she would carry silently for the rest of her life. But she could, with absolute certainty, hit what she aimed at. And in the autumn of 1875, or possibly in the spring of 1881, that certainty was about to introduce her to a man she would love for the next 50 years, and to a career that would make her the first American female superstar. The man on the other side of that line had traveled a long way to get there. Francis E. Butler was born in County Longford, Ireland. His baptism was recorded on January 30th, 1847, in the Temple Michael and Ballymacormac parish of the Ardagh and Clonmacnoise diocese. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Michael Butler and Catherine Whelan. When he was 13 years old, he came to the United States, alone, by most accounts, crossing the Atlantic on his own and landing in a country that had no reason to welcome him. Irish immigrants in the 1850s and 1860s faced the kind of ugly prejudice that a century later would mostly be forgotten by the people who had inflicted it. Signs in shop windows read, "No Irish need apply." Political cartoons in Harper's Weekly depicted Irishmen as apes. A 13-year-old boy arriving alone in that country had to make a living in the margins, and that is what Frank Butler did. He cleaned stables. He tried his hand at glass blowing near Camden, New Jersey. He took whatever odd jobs he could find. He married a woman named Henrietta Saunders around 1870 when he was in his early 20s. They had 2 children, a boy named Edward and a girl named Katie. The marriage did not last. They divorced a few years later, a messy and not yet final separation that would complicate the historical record of everything Frank did next. Somewhere along the way, he discovered he could shoot. Marksmanship in the 1870s was a growing form of popular entertainment. The country had just emerged from the Civil War with millions of men newly trained in the use of firearms, and the public appetite for exhibitions, for feats of skill and nerve, was enormous. Variety theaters and traveling shows booked marksmen the way a later generation would book jugglers or magicians. A good shooter, with a steady hand and a sense of showmanship, could make a living. Butler built an act. For a time, he partnered with a man named Bauman under the name Bauman and Butler. Later, he would partner with John Graham. The act was one of perhaps 18 on a variety bill. The shooters would come on for 20 minutes or so, rattle off trick shots at glass balls and stationary targets, and then yield the stage to a ventriloquist or a comic singer or a team of acrobats. Between engagements, on the road, Butler would routinely issue the same challenge: $100 to any local shooter who could beat him. $100 in 1875 was a small fortune. In today's money, it equals roughly $2,900. That kind of money tends to draw people out of their homes. Which brings us to Cincinnati. Here, the historical record gives us something unusual and worth acknowledging: genuine disagreement. The traditional account, the one told most often, the one Annie herself seems to have embraced, is that the match took place on Thanksgiving Day in 1875, when Annie was 15. In that version, the Bauman and Butler shooting act was performing in Cincinnati. Frank Butler had placed his standard bet with a Cincinnati hotel owner named Jack Frost. The hotelier knew a young markswoman in the region whose reputation had traveled to his door, a girl from Darke County who had been shooting game for the shipments his customers bought. He arranged the match. The last opponent Frank Butler ever expected, it was later said, was a 5-foot-tall, 15-year-old girl named Annie. But in 2014, Cincinnati Enquirer reporter Jeff Seuss dug into the historical details and raised a troubling question. The Beavis House Hotel, where the match is supposed to have taken place, was being managed by Martin Beavis and W.H. Ridenour in 1875. Jack Frost did not take over management of the hotel until 1879. The Bauman and Butler shooting act did not appear in the pages of the Cincinnati Enquirer until 1880. Biographer Shirl Casper has argued, on the basis of interviews Frank Butler gave in 1903 and 1924, that the match may actually have taken place in the spring of 1881 near Greenville, possibly in a town called North Star. Other sources point to North Fairmount, near Cincinnati, as the likely location if the event occurred in 1881. So we have two possible stories. In one, Annie was 15, and the year was 1875. In the other, she was 20, and the year was 1881. Both are defensible from the historical record. Neither can be proven definitively, because the time of the event was never written down in the moment. What we know for certain is that the match happened because Frank Butler spent the rest of his life telling people it had happened, and because Annie Oakley emerged from it a married woman with a career. Whatever the date, the match itself unfolded this way. The two shooters took turns firing at live pigeons released from traps, 25 birds each. The rules were straightforward: hit the bird cleanly, the point counted; miss, or drop the bird outside a boundary line, the point did not. After 24 shots apiece, they were tied. Each of them had hit every single bird. Then came the 25th. The account Annie and Frank both told, and the one that most sources preserve, is that Butler missed. His final shot failed. Annie's final shot hit. She had scored 25 out of 25. Butler had scored 24. A 15-year-old girl, with no training beyond what she had given herself in the Ohio woods, had just outshot a professional marksman in front of a paying crowd. A second account survives, one that gives Butler the dignity of having hit the 25th bird, but notes that his shot dropped the pigeon dead about 2 feet beyond the boundary line. By the rules of the match, that made it a miss. Annie won either way. Butler's later recollection of the moment was romantic. He said, looking back, that he had been a battered man the instant she appeared. It was not defeat that surprised him. It was her. She was small. She was young. She was dressed in the plain, homemade way of a Quaker farm girl. She walked to the line with no swagger, no performance, and she lifted the rifle like it was the most natural thing in the world. He watched her shoot. He watched her bird fall. And he, who had come into that afternoon expecting to collect $100, left it having fallen in love. He began courting her that same night. The courtship was not brief, and it was not simple. Frank Butler's divorce from Henrietta Saunders was not yet final in 1876. An 1880 U.S. Census record still listed Saunders as married. And so, although Annie would always maintain that she and Frank had married on August 23, 1876 in Cincinnati, no recorded certificate of that date exists. The only surviving marriage record on file with the Archives of Ontario under registration number 49594 shows a wedding on June 20, 1882, in Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit. Biographers have long debated the discrepancy. The most persuasive explanation is simply this. Frank's divorce from his first wife had not been cleanly finalized in 1876, and so Annie, who always insisted on propriety, preferred to speak of the earlier date, the date she considered, in her heart, her marriage, while the legal record caught up years later in Ontario. There is also a showbiz reason. Throughout her stage career, Annie's age was consistently reported as 5 or 6 years younger than she truly was. A later marriage date, 1882, would have made her look younger, and that was good for the posters. The earlier date made her the age she actually was. Annie chose to stand by the truth. One thing is not debated. Once they were together for 50 years. Frank Butler was by all accounts a kind man. He did not drink, he did not smoke, he did not gamble. He was a churchgoer. He was, by the Quaker standards of Annie's mother, Susan Shaw, a man you could invite to dinner without flinching. And when he and Annie moved in together, first in Cincinnati, he treated her with a steadiness that she had never known from a man in her life. The woods, the infirmary, the house of the wolves. None of it had prepared her for what love from a decent man actually looked like. She found out, and she never let go of it. For the first years of the marriage, though, Annie was not yet a performer. She was a wife. She kept the household. She traveled with Frank as he continued his act, first still with Bauman, later with John Graham, and she waited in the wings. That changed on May 1st, 1882. The Butlers were performing in Springfield, Ohio. Frank's partner, John Graham, had taken ill. The show needed its shooter, and Frank, who had never seen his wife perform for a paying audience, asked Annie to come on with him. "Just hold the targets," he told her. "Just fill in." She came out. She held the targets. Frank began his act. But for reasons the historical record does not fully explain, Frank began to miss. He was not shooting well that night. A spectator called out from the seats, "Let the girl shoot." Annie took the rifle. She hit everything Frank had missed, and she hit the targets Frank set up fresh, and the crowd came out of its chairs. That was the night the shooting team of Butler and Oakley was born. Annie, who until that moment had been Mrs. Frank Butler in private and anonymous in public, adopted the stage name that would carry her for the rest of her life, the name Oakley. It was not a family name. It was, most probably, borrowed from the neighborhood of Oakley in Cincinnati, where the Butlers had lived, though one old story says she took it from a man named Oakley who had paid her train fare as a child. Whichever is true, by that night in Springfield, Phoebe Ann Mosey of Darke County had become Annie Oakley of the stage. They traveled with their dog, a poodle named George. George was not a pet. He was part of the act. Frank would throw objects, and Annie would shoot them out of the air, and between rounds, George would fetch whatever fell to the floor and deliver it to whichever of them needed it. The Butlers lived cheap, on the road, in theatrical boarding houses, taking their pay week by week. In 1884, they signed with the Sells Brothers Circus, billed as champion rifle shots. And in March of that year, in St. Paul, Minnesota, Annie Oakley met a man whose name was known on 4 continents. Sitting Bull was in St. Paul that month under guard. He was the Hunkpapa Lakota leader who had, less than 8 years earlier, presided over one of the most famous military defeats in American history. On June 25th, 1876, at the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had annihilated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry. Sitting Bull had been the spiritual leader of the gathering of tribes that made that battle possible. He had had a vision before the fight of soldiers falling into his camp like grasshoppers with their heads down. When the soldiers fell, his vision was remembered. He became, in that moment, one of the most famous men alive. And then, like every other leader of the Plains resistance, he was ground down by the U.S. Army. He led his people into Canada for 4 years. They starved there. In 1881, he surrendered at Fort Buford in Dakota Territory. He was held as a political prisoner at Fort Randall and later at Fort Yates. By 1884, he was technically paroled, but his movements were watched, and his freedom was not his own. He was permitted to appear in American entertainment venues under supervision, which is how one of the great military leaders of the 19th century came to be on a stage in Minnesota. He was there to be looked at. And in that same town, that same week, a 23-year-old sharpshooter from Ohio was about to perform. Sitting Bull had already heard of Annie. He had seen handbills, but he had not yet watched her shoot. On March 19, 1884, at a performance he attended in St. Paul, she came onto the stage, according to biographer R.A. Keistler Grack, skipped playfully out, lifted her rifle, and with a single shot extinguished the flame of a burning candle. Then she knocked corks off bottles. Then she shot cleanly through a cigar Frank Butler held in his teeth. Sitting Bull believed that what he was watching was not possible. He believed, as he later said, that she must be gifted by supernatural means. No ordinary woman could shoot that way with both hands. He offered $65, the equivalent of more than $2,000 today, for a photograph of himself and Annie together. He sought her out. He met her. They talked through interpreters. Something happened in that meeting that was not performance. Annie and Sitting Bull became friends. They became, by every account that has come down to us, genuinely and mutually fond of one another. Annie would speak of him for the rest of her life with a respect that went beyond the polite. Sitting Bull, for his part, came to regard her with the affection he might have given a daughter. Later that year, in a ceremonial gesture of the kind his culture took seriously, he symbolically adopted her. He gave her a Lakota name, Watanya Cecilia, which was rendered for the English-speaking public as Little Sure Shot. The name stuck. It became, in time, a brand. It was on her posters and her press. It is on her monuments to this day. It is important to pause here because the relationship between Annie Oakley and Sitting Bull sits inside a larger and more uncomfortable truth. Sitting Bull was, at the time he adopted Annie, a man stripped of his land, his sovereignty, and most of his power. His people were confined to reservations. His warriors were disarmed. He was being displayed for paying crowds in a country that had just finished breaking him. The genuine bond he formed with Annie did not exist outside of that. It existed inside it. It was one human being recognizing another inside a machinery of conquest that was grinding down everything he loved. We can honor the friendship without pretending the context did not exist. Annie, to her credit, never pretended. In her later writings, she spoke of him with reverence. In 1890, when he was killed by Indian police on the Standing Rock Reservation during the Ghost Dance unrest, she mourned him. He had been her friend. One further piece of the Sitting Bull story deserves to be told because it illuminates the kind of person Annie was becoming in the mid-1880s. After their first meeting in St. Paul, Sitting Bull insisted on giving her gifts. Among them was a pair of moccasins, hand-beaded in the traditional hunk-papa style, which he gave her as part of the adoption ceremony. Annie kept those moccasins for the rest of her life. They are preserved today among her personal effects. A dead hunk-papa leader's gift, carried by a Quaker farm girl from Ohio through 3 decades of show business and 2 continents of touring, and laid away at her death in a trunk for museum curators to find. The relationship between them was recorded in its small physical objects far more faithfully than in the grand narratives that both of them were being folded into by the public of the 1880s. Annie was being written up as Little Sure Shot. Sitting Bull was being written up as the vanquished chief. The truth, in the moccasins and in the letters and in the few private photographs they had taken together, was quieter and closer to the human bone. 2 people from impossibly different worlds had met, recognized something real in each other, and stayed in correspondence as long as correspondence was possible. When he was killed, she mourned him not as a famous person mourning another famous person, but as a person who had lost a friend. These are the details that ought to survive. In 1884, though, the grim future was still unwritten. The Butlers finished their season with the Sells Brothers Circus, and then, in April of 1885, they signed with the show that would make Annie Oakley famous forever. They signed with Buffalo Bill. William Frederick Cody was, in April 1885, the most famous showman in America. To understand what Annie Oakley was walking into, it is worth spending a moment on the man and the enterprise she was about to become the star of. Cody had been born on February 26, 1846, on a farm just outside LeClaire, Iowa Territory. His father, Isaac Cody, was an abolitionist who had been stabbed at a pro-slavery meeting in Kansas in 1854 during the border violence of Bleeding, Kansas, and who died in 1857 from the lingering effects of that attack. 11-year-old Bill went to work for the freight carrier Russell, Majors, and Waddell to support the family. He rode courier as a boy. He served as a private in the 7th Kansas Cavalry during the Civil War. After the war, he worked as a scout for the U.S. Army, a buffalo hunter supplying meat to the crews of the Kansas Pacific Railway, and a guide for wealthy Eastern hunting parties. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1872 for his service as a civilian scout in the Indian Wars, an award that would later be rescinded along with 910 others in a 1917 reorganization of the medal's criteria, and then, after a decades-long campaign by his descendants, finally restored to him posthumously in 1989. He earned his nickname in an 1867 8-hour buffalo shooting match against another hunter named Bill Comstock. Cody killed 68 animals. Comstock killed 48. The name Buffalo Bill, along with the right to use it, went to Cody. Then came Ned Buntline. In 1869, the 23-year-old Cody crossed paths with the dime novel writer, and Buntline turned him into a hero of pulp fiction. The novels were largely invented. They sold millions of copies. By the time Cody saw one of his own stories dramatized on stage in 1872, he had decided to dramatize himself. He toured in Wild West stage plays through the 1870s, and in 1883, in the area of North Platte, Nebraska, he founded the enterprise that would carry his name around the world, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was not a circus. It was not a theatrical production in the ordinary sense. It was a vast, outdoor historical pageant staged in open-air arenas with real cowboys, real Native American performers. The posters called them show Indians, real bison, real horses, real stagecoaches. The show reenacted the riding of the Pony Express. It reenacted Indian attacks on wagon trains. It reenacted stagecoach holdups and cavalry rescues. Cody himself rode as the centerpiece, and the show toured across the United States and eventually across Europe. When Annie Oakley and Frank Butler signed with Buffalo Bill's Wild West in April 1885, they were walking into the most ambitious traveling entertainment the world had ever seen. From the beginning, something unusual happened. Until that moment, in every act Annie had performed, either Frank had received top billing or they had shared the stage. That ended the day they joined Buffalo Bill. Cody, with the instincts of a born showman, saw in Annie something the public would respond to. The small, modest, plainly dressed young woman who could outshoot any man in the building. And he made her the star. Her name went on the posters as Champion Markswoman. She opened the show. Frank Butler made the decision that would define the rest of his professional life. He stepped off the stage. He took on the role of Annie's manager, her target holder, her press agent, her business partner. He did not resent her. By every account that has come down to us, letters, interviews, photographs, the testimony of people who worked with them, he was proud of her. Annie would say, many years later, that the financial part of their lives was always in her husband's hands. She shot. He ran the business. They made, together, a kind of marriage that was both unusual for the 19th century and quietly enduring. The partnership was also a business arrangement of considerable sophistication. Frank handled the contracts. Frank handled the press. Frank handled the travel arrangements and the payroll disputes and the small diplomatic crises that a touring company the size of the Wild West produced on a weekly basis. Annie, freed from those burdens, could concentrate entirely on her shooting. She could rehearse new tricks. She could sight in new rifles. She could maintain her body for the demands of a performance schedule that would have broken most men. And Frank, whose own shooting career was eclipsed by his wife's, found a form of usefulness that suited him. He had been an entertainer himself. He knew the business. He knew what reporters wanted. He knew what promoters wanted. He knew, with the eye of a man who had come up from nothing, how to read a contract for its hidden traps. He was not a flashy manager in the mold of some of the theatrical agents of the era. He was quiet, professional, and loyal to his client, who was also his wife. Annie, for her part, was loyal to him. She refused, consistently, to accept outside management offers. Other showmen tried, over the years, to pry her away from Buffalo Bill's Wild West and from Frank's management. Richer contracts were offered. Bigger billings were promised. Annie declined them all. She trusted Frank, and she trusted Cody, and she valued her own stability above the additional money she might have made by uprooting herself. That kind of steadiness in the transient world of late 19th century show business was itself a kind of genius. Her repertoire took shape. At 30 paces, she could split a playing card held edge-on so that it fell in two halves. She could hit dimes tossed into the air. She could shoot the ash off a cigarette held in Frank Butler's lips. She could, with a playing card thrown into the air, riddle it with bullets before it touched the ground, a trick that gave rise to an enduring piece of American theatrical slang. To this day, punched complimentary tickets in the theater business are sometimes called Annie Oakleys because they look, when held up to the light, like one of her playing cards. She could shoot aimed backwards, using a mirror. She could, at a full gallop on horseback, hit glass balls Frank threw into the air. She was not doing a trick. She was doing a body of work, built up over years, refined season by season, performed with a precision that never varied. She did it, night after night, in front of audiences that did not, at first, believe their eyes. The earnings followed. In the Wild West, Annie Oakley made more money than any other performer in the show, except Buffalo Bill Cody himself. The biographers who have gone through the financial records have confirmed this repeatedly. A girl who had, 20 years earlier, stood barefoot in the snow while a family beat her, was now one of the highest-paid entertainers in the United States. She also, almost from the beginning, faced competition. In 1886, Cody hired another young markswoman named Lillian Smith. Smith was 15 when she joined. She was 11 years younger than Annie. She shot a rifle with considerable skill, and she was willing to self-promote in ways that Annie found distasteful. The press, always looking for a rivalry, found one. Annie, who had been 26 at the time Smith was hired, began, perhaps in direct response to Smith's youth, to understate her own age. For the rest of her public life, newspapers would report her as being 5 or 6 years younger than she truly was. It was small deception, and a gentle one by the standards of the time, but it lasted. When she died in 1926, some obituaries had her age wrong. The rivalry with Smith became uncomfortable enough that Annie temporarily left the Wild West. When Lillian Smith departed in 1889, Annie returned, just in time for the trip that would change everything. In May 1887, Buffalo Bill's Wild West had sailed for England. The show was engaged as part of the American exhibition, held in London in conjunction with Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, the celebration of her 50 years on the throne. Annie was already with the show, and this was her first European tour. What happened in London would remake her reputation not just in America, but in the world. The crossing was stormy. The ship rolled in the North Atlantic, horses panicked in their stalls, Native American performers, many of whom had never seen an ocean, endured a passage that bore no relation to anything in their experience. They arrived intact, and the company set up in Earl's Court. The show opened on May 9, 1887, and from the first performance it was a phenomenon. The London newspapers reported that all the world and his wife were there. The show, one paper said, was on every tongue. Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, requested a private preview. He attended with his wife, the Princess of Wales, and with the Crown Prince of Denmark. 4 days before the public opening of the exhibition, on May 5th, the prince and his party took up their position on a grandstand to watch the first complete performance of Buffalo Bill's Wild West on British soil. It lasted 90 minutes. The prince was impressed enough that he moved to arrange something unprecedented, a command performance for Queen Victoria herself. The Queen was not in the habit of appearing at public entertainments. Her husband, Prince Albert, had died in 1861, and in the 26 years since, she had largely withdrawn from public view. For her to attend a show, any show, was an event of its own. On May 11, 1887, Queen Victoria came to Earl's Court. The historical records of that performance are strikingly detailed. As the American flag, carried by a mounted rider, passed the royal box, the Queen rose from her seat and bowed deeply to the banner. The entire court rose with her. Noblemen uncovered their heads. Generals saluted. It was, for a country still sore from the American Revolution, an extraordinary gesture of recognition. After the performance, the Queen met the performers. She met Buffalo Bill. She met the Lakota performer, Red Shirt. and she met a 5-foot-tall American sharpshooter named Annie Oakley. "You are a very, very clever little girl," the Queen said. Annie, with the self-possession that would carry her through every royal encounter of her life, accepted the compliment with a curtsy and a thank you. She was 26 years old. She had been hungry enough, as a child, to steal food. She had stood in the snow barefoot at the hands of a family she would not name. She had shot birds through the head because the meat had to be unspoiled to sell. And now, the queen of the largest empire on the planet was calling her a clever little girl, and she was letting it pass without so much as a blink. The command performance that had been arranged by the Prince of Wales took place on June 20th, 1887, as part of Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebrations. Royalty from all over Europe attended. The future Kaiser Wilhelm II was there. The future King George V was there. Kings, queens, princes, and princesses watched a show about the American frontier, and Annie Oakley was the one they could not stop applauding. The loudest applause of the night, one paper reported, was reserved for her. She was, it declared, far and away the show's best marksman. It is worth sitting with that London summer because it was the hinge on which the rest of Annie's life would swing. London in 1887 was the capital of the largest empire the world had ever known. It was a city of more than 4 million people, the wealthiest metropolis on the planet, and it was at the absolute height of its 19th century confidence. Queen Victoria had ruled for 50 years. Her sons and daughters sat on thrones across Europe. Her ships patrolled every ocean. Her factories produced the goods that stocked the shops of every capital from Buenos Aires to Calcutta. And into that city, in the spring of 1887, rolled a circus of American cowboys, American Indians, and one small Ohio woman with a rifle. The British had opinions about Americans. Most of them were not flattering. The American Civil War was only 22 years in the past. The American West was, to London's reading public, a place of dime novels and dubious manners, populated by gunfighters and card sharks, and, they suspected, women of uncertain character. The expectation, when the Wild West first arrived, was that London would tolerate the show as a novelty for a week or two and then grow bored. London did not grow bored. The show became the event of the Jubilee summer. The newspapers wrote about it every day. Members of Parliament attended. The great and the near great were photographed in the grandstand. The Prince of Wales, who had a weakness for all novel amusements, returned again and again. The receptions Buffalo Bill gave at Earl's Court were crammed with dukes, duchesses, and the foreign ambassadors then in London for the Jubilee. And at the center of it, more than Cody himself, in the eyes of many observers, was the young woman from Darke County. London had never seen anything quite like Annie Oakley. The British society ladies who came to watch her were accustomed to women performers of a particular type: music hall singers, ballet dancers, actresses in the London theaters, who carried, fairly or not, a whiff of moral compromise. Annie carried none of that. She walked into reception rooms on the arm of her husband. She curtsied with the precision of a country girl who had practiced in a mirror. She declined alcoholic drinks with a polite firmness that charmed the teetotalers and puzzled everyone else. She wore the embroidered dresses she had sewn herself, and while the cloth was not the finest silk in the room, the workmanship was admired. And then, in the arena, she shot, and she shot, and she shot, and she shot, and the London ladies, who had come perhaps to see an American curiosity, left having seen a phenomenon. She was invited to tea by Lady So-and-so. She was photographed by leading London photographers. She was sent letters by women who had never met her and who simply wanted to say, in writing, that she had changed their view of what was possible for a female person to do. She saved a number of those letters. Some of them are still preserved in the archives of the Garst Museum in Greenville, Ohio. None of this turned her head. A lesser personality would have been unmoored. A lesser personality would have decided that she was now an international celebrity and adjusted her manner accordingly. Put on airs, demanded more money, developed a stage diva's temperament. Annie, by every account that has come down to us, did none of those things. She continued to call her husband Frank. She continued to be courteous to stagehands. She continued to tip generously out of her earnings. She continued to sew her own clothes. The modesty was not a performance. It was who she actually was. The Quaker farm girl of Darke County had not been erased by London. She had simply been transported there. When Buffalo Bill's Wild West returned to America in May 1888 after its triumphant London run, Annie Oakley came home a world-famous woman. And she went largely to Nutley and to her garden and to Frank and to the dogs. There is one more London moment worth preserving because it shows something about her character that the more formal biographical sources tend to miss. During the Jubilee summer, a tradition developed in which European royalty who came to London for the celebrations would request private introductions to the performers of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The show accommodated them. Queen Isabella of Spain came. King Leopold of Belgium came. The Crown Prince of Denmark came. They were shown around the encampment. They shook hands with cowboys and Lakota leaders and the camp cooks. They met Annie. One of the royal visitors, a minor German princeling whose name the archives do not reliably record, apparently made a suggestive remark to Annie during one of these introductions. Annie's response has been transmitted to us in several slightly different versions, all of them consistent in their essentials. She looked the prince directly in the eye. She said, in a voice calm enough to carry to the other witnesses without being loud, that in her country, gentlemen did not speak to ladies in such a fashion, and that she presumed in his country they did not either. She then curtsied, excused herself, and walked away. The prince, by the accounts that survive, went red to his collar and did not speak again for the rest of the reception. Buffalo Bill, when he heard about the incident later, is said to have laughed aloud. That was Annie Oakley. She would curtsy for a queen. She would not, under any circumstances, lower her own self-respect for a man who wore a title. Buffalo Bill's Wild West closed its successful London run in October 1887 after more than 300 performances with more than 2.5 million tickets sold. The tour made additional stops in Birmingham and Manchester before the company returned to the United States in May 1888 for a short summer tour. It is worth saying clearly what had just happened. A girl born in a log cabin in Ohio, whose father had died in a blizzard, who had been sold out to a family of abusers at the age of 9, who had paid off her mother's mortgage by shooting birds for a grocery store, had, in the space of 30 months, become known by name to the crowned heads of Europe. Queen Victoria had called her clever. The papers were calling her the champion. When she walked into a London drawing room, heads turned, and she did it without ever changing who she was. She wore her hair long and loose. She dressed modestly. She did not smoke, drink, or curse in public. She arrived at receptions on the arm of her husband. She was a Quaker girl from Darke County, and she was also the international celebrity of the moment, and the reconciliation of those two facts seems to have given her no difficulty whatsoever. The second European tour was bigger than the first. Buffalo Bill's Wild West returned to Europe in May 1889, this time as part of the Exposition Universelle in Paris, the enormous World's Fair that commemorated the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, and that debuted the Eiffel Tower. The show set up for a 6-month run in Paris. Rosa Bonheur, the leading female painter of Europe, painted Buffalo Bill's portrait. The crowds were enormous. President Marie-Françoise Sadi Carnot of France attended. Annie performed her full repertoire, and the French press, always skeptical of American imports, admitted without qualification that she was the real thing. From Paris, the tour moved into the south of France, then to Barcelona, then into Italy. While in Rome, Buffalo Bill Cody was received by Pope Leo XIII. The Colosseum was considered as a venue and rejected because the condition of the ancient ruin would not allow it. At Verona, though, the Wild West did perform in the ancient Roman amphitheater. Cowboys and Indians and a girl from Ohio shooting playing cards in an arena that had once hosted gladiators. The tour moved on to Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and it was in Germany that Annie performed what became, in retrospect, one of the most discussed shots of her career. In Berlin, probably in the summer of 1889, though the exact date is not preserved, she was performing her cigarette trick. Normally, Frank Butler held the cigarette between his lips, and Annie shot the ash off it. It was one of the signature shots of her repertoire. On this occasion, a young man in the audience insisted on holding the cigarette himself. He was Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany. He would, the following year, ascend to the throne as Kaiser Wilhelm II, ruler of the newly unified German Empire. Annie, by every account, tried to dissuade him. The Crown Prince refused to be dissuaded. He walked into the ring. He placed the cigarette in his mouth. Annie raised her rifle. She fired. The ash fell from the cigarette. The Crown Prince was unharmed. A quarter of a century later, the First World War broke out. Europe ran red. Millions of young men died in trenches from Flanders to the Somme, to Ypres, to the Marne. And Annie Oakley, looking back on Berlin, reflected, with the dry edge of a woman who had seen too much of the 20th century, that if she had shot the Kaiser instead of the cigarette, she might have saved the lives of several million soldiers. She said she did not know then that he would swing the iron fist and shake the universe. Perhaps, she said, it was well for both of them that humans lack foresight. Frank Butler, who was always alert to a good opportunity, apparently sat down during the war and wrote a letter to the Kaiser, telling him that Annie Oakley wanted to repeat the shot. The Kaiser, unsurprisingly, did not reply. The second European tour continued. The show played Austria-Hungary. It played Belgium and the Netherlands in 1891. It returned to Great Britain for another command performance for Queen Victoria in 1892. By the time the Wild West finally came back to the United States in 1892, after 3 years abroad, Annie Oakley was a name in every capital of Europe. She had performed for Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, King Umberto I of Italy, President Sadi Carnot of France, and the man who would shortly be Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. She had been received by princes, archdukes, cardinals, and the leading artists of the continent. She had done it all wearing a dress she had made herself, and she came home to America. From 1892 to 1904, Annie and Frank made their home in Nutley, New Jersey, when they were not on the road. Nutley in those years was a small town across the Hudson River from New York City, and it was convenient for travel. They had no children, they had their dogs, they had each other. Annie continued to perform both with the Wild West and in side engagements that brought her extra income. She gave exhibitions at shooting matches across the country. She was a regular at traps hooting events, setting records that stood for decades. In 1893, Cody rebranded the show as Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World. It was an international act now. It included not just American cowboys and Native Americans, but gauchos from Argentina, vaqueros from Mexico, Cossacks from Russia, Arab horsemen, Turks, Mongols, Georgians. Cody set up an independent exhibition next to the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the Great Columbian Exposition. The fair's organizers had turned him down. Cody put up his tents across the street and drew their crowd. It was, by the end of the season, one of the most profitable years in the history of the show. And it was during this period that Annie Oakley stepped in front of Thomas Edison's cameras. Buffalo Bill Cody was a friend of Edison's. Edison had built a large electrical generator for the Wild West show. On September 24, 1894, Buffalo Bill and 15 of his show Indians appeared in 2 kinetoscope films shot in Edison's Black Maria studio in West Orange, New Jersey. And on November 1, 1894, Annie and Frank came to the same studio. The film was shot by William Heiser. It lasted 21 seconds. It ran at 30 frames per second on 39 feet of film. It was the 11th motion picture ever made after commercial showings began on April 14, 1894. In it, Annie is seen shooting at stationary and moving targets. Frank is seen, glimpsed at the edges, throwing glass balls into the air for her to shatter. It is the earliest moving image we have of Annie Oakley, and it survives. You can still watch it today. A girl from a log cabin in Darke County was one of the first moving images recorded in human history. The 1890s rolled on, and Annie Oakley settled into the strange double life of a woman who was simultaneously a national celebrity and a quiet Quaker wife. On the road, she was little sure shot. She performed most nights of the week during the tour season. She was interviewed by reporters in every city the Wild West played, and she learned to manage those interviews with the tact of a diplomat. When asked her age, she shaved off 5 or 6 years. When asked about other female performers, she was polite. When asked about shooting itself, she was animated and specific, and she would, to the surprise of reporters expecting vanity, speak with precision about the weight of powder in her cartridges and the rifling in her barrels. She knew her trade. Off the road in Nutley, she was Mrs. Frank Butler. She kept a garden, she entertained visitors, she went to church. She corresponded with women across the country, many of them young women who had written to her for advice or for encouragement, or simply to tell her that her picture on a lithographed poster had meant something to them during a hard year. She began, quietly and without fanfare, to teach women to shoot. Over the course of her career, it is believed that Annie Oakley personally instructed more than 15,000 women in the use of firearms. Some of this was formal, lessons arranged through clubs and associations. Much of it was informal. A woman would come to one of Annie's performances, linger afterward, and ask a question. Annie would answer. Sometimes a meeting at the arena would become an appointment for the next day, at a range where Annie, in her plain dress and her long hair, would spend an afternoon showing another woman how to stand, how to breathe, how to sight along the barrel. Her reasoning was explicit, and she gave it publicly. She believed that women should learn to shoot for their health as a form of physical and mental exercise, and for their safety. She believed in women's self-defense. She believed, in a way that went against much of what 19th century America told itself about women's proper sphere, that a woman who could handle a gun was a woman who was harder to victimize. She said it plainly. I would like to see every woman know how to handle guns as naturally as they know how to handle babies. When asked whether it was proper for a woman to shoot, she would look at the questioner and reply, in effect, that she had been asked the question for 30 years, and every year she grew more certain of her answer. Women were every bit as capable as men when offered the opportunity. She provided, she liked to say, substantial evidence. Her advocacy went beyond informal instruction. In April 1898, with the Spanish-American War looming, she sat down at her desk and wrote a letter to President William McKinley. The letter, dated April 5, 1898, offered the government the services of a company of 50 lady sharpshooters who would, she promised, provide their own arms and ammunition should the United States go to war with Spain. The letter still exists in the National Archives. McKinley did not accept the offer. The war went forward without Annie's 50 women, but the fact that she had made the offer at a moment when the idea of women in combat was essentially unimaginable in American public life placed her permanently on a list of quiet pioneers. Theodore Roosevelt named his volunteer cavalry the Rough Riders, after Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World. He did not name them after Annie, but the inspiration for the brand he borrowed was, in no small measure, her. The turn of the century came, and with it, new plans. And then came the train. On October 29th, 1901, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was on tour in the southeastern United States. The show train was traveling by rail from Charlotte, North Carolina, to Danville, Virginia, a short hop that should have been unremarkable. Outside the town of Lexington, North Carolina, a freight train, whose engineer had mistakenly believed the entire show train had already passed, backed onto the main line. The show train, running as 3 separate units, had not yet fully cleared. The freight locomotive struck one of the units. The crash was horrific. 110 horses were killed in the collision or had to be destroyed afterward. Cody's beloved mounts, Old Pap and Old Eagle, were among them. 3 young Native American performers were killed. Many others were injured. Annie Oakley was among the injured. Her back was badly hurt, so badly that doctors initially told her she would never walk again. She suffered temporary paralysis. Over the following year and a half, she underwent 5 operations on her spine. She was 31 years old, or, depending on which year the newspapers were reporting her age in, 36. And she had been an active performer nearly continuously since the age of 21, or 21, by her public accounting. She walked out of the rehabilitation eventually. The doctors who had said she would never walk again were wrong, but she did not return to the Wild West. She and Frank left Buffalo Bill's company in 1901. Annie was now in her 40s, and her body had given her a warning she could not ignore. She began a less taxing career. In 1902, a playwright wrote a stage play specifically for her called The Western Girl. She played a woman named Nancy Berry, who used a pistol, a rifle, and a rope to outsmart a gang of outlaws. The play toured. It was not the Wild West. It did not draw the hundreds of thousands of tickets Cody's show had drawn in London, but it put her back on the stage, and it put income in the household. And it was during this period in 1904 that she fought one of the most revealing battles of her life. The newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, the same Hearst who had famously cabled his correspondent in Cuba to furnish the pictures and promised he would furnish the war, decided in the summer of 1904 that sensational cocaine prohibition stories were selling well. Hearst papers across the country needed copy. One of his reporters, working a Chicago beat, seized on a piece of criminal news. A burlesque performer had been arrested in Chicago. She had given the arresting officers a false name, identifying herself as Annie Oakley. The story was filed, cabled, and on Hearst's instructions, printed. A story that Annie Oakley had been arrested for stealing a pair of trousers to support a cocaine habit. It was not true. The woman who had been arrested was not Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley was a teetotaler. She had never used cocaine. She had, at that moment, been living a quiet life with Frank in New Jersey, practicing her shooting, corresponding with friends, preparing for another stage tour. Most of the newspapers that had picked up the Hearst story retracted it with apologies as soon as the truth became clear. Hearst himself did not apologize. When Annie and Frank began filing libel suits to clear her name, Hearst tried to avoid paying the anticipated court judgments, which ran to $20,000 per case, a staggering sum, the equivalent of roughly $700,000 in today's money, by sending an investigator to Darke County, Ohio. The investigator was under instructions to collect reputation-smearing gossip from Annie Oakley's past. He was to find old neighbors who could tell ugly stories about the Mosey family, old acquaintances who remembered something scandalous, anything at all that Hearst's lawyers could use to muddy Annie's reputation in court. The investigator found nothing. There was nothing to find. There was a woman who had grown up poor, who had paid off her mother's mortgage by shooting birds, who had married a man she was faithful to for 50 years, who did not drink, who did not gamble, who did not use narcotics, who gave away a significant portion of her earnings to orphanages, and who spent her time teaching women to defend themselves. The Hearst investigator came back empty-handed. Annie Oakley spent much of the next 6 years pursuing libel lawsuits against the newspapers that had published the false story. She filed 55 of them. She won 54. Her legal expenses, in the end, exceeded what she collected in judgments. She did not care. She wanted the record corrected. She went after the papers one by one, city by city, judgment by judgment, until her name had been cleared everywhere the lie had traveled. It was a woman's way of standing her ground. She did not yell. She did not threaten. She did not give inflammatory interviews. She went to court, and she went to court, and she went to court, and when it was over, she had, at great personal cost, made Hearst pay for his falsehood. The cost was real. Those 6 years were not a victory lap. They were a slog. Annie traveled from city to city to appear in courtrooms. She sat through depositions. She answered the same questions from hostile lawyers about her youth, her marriage, her finances, and her daily habits. She let strangers comb through her private life for a scrap of dirt they could use against her. She missed shooting seasons. She paid lawyers out of her own earnings. She aged visibly during the ordeal, and the stress of it almost certainly contributed to the health problems that would dog her in later years. She did it anyway, and when it was done, she returned to Nutley and to Frank and to her dogs, and she never publicly complained about what it had cost her. She had defended her name. That was enough. The years after the Hearst fight were quieter. In 1911, Annie returned briefly to the arena with Vernon Seaver's Young Buffalo show, with Frank again as her manager. They toured from 1911 to 1913. Frank also signed a contract as a representative for the Union Metallic Cartridge Company in Connecticut, and later for the Remington Arms Company. The arrangement allowed him and Annie to continue endorsements and exhibitions without the grinding schedule of a full Wild West season. In 1913, after more than 3 decades of continuous performing, the Butlers retired from the arena. They built a brick bungalow in Cambridge, Maryland. It would later be listed in 1996 on the National Register of Historic Places as the Annie Oakley House. In Cambridge, they took in a dog named Dave, named for Annie's old friend Dave Montgomery of the comedy team Montgomery and Stone, who would, when they returned to exhibition shooting, become part of the act. One of the tricks involved Annie shooting an apple off the top of Dave's head. He stood still for it. In 1917, the Butlers moved to Pinehurst, North Carolina. That same year, on January 10, 1917, Buffalo Bill Cody died in Denver. He was 70 years old. He had outlived 2 of his 4 children. His Wild West had gone bankrupt in 1913. His last years had been spent trying, with increasing difficulty, to keep his name in front of the public he had ridden to fame. Annie, who had worked at his side for 17 years, wrote a touching eulogy for him, for the man, and for the golden era she knew was passing with him. The United States entered the First World War in 1917. Annie, nearly 60 years old, once again offered to raise a regiment of women volunteers. Once again, she was refused. She pivoted. She volunteered to teach marksmanship to the troops preparing to ship out. She gave her time to the National War Council of the Young Men's Christian Association, to War Camp Community Service, and to the Red Cross. Her dog, Dave, became, in a piece of promotional genius, the Red Cross dog. trained to sniff out donations of cash hidden in handkerchiefs at fundraising events. People came to meet Dave. They left, having given money. By the end of the war, Annie had slowed. She had not stopped. In 1922, at the age of 62, she hit 100 clay targets in a row from 16 yards at a shooting contest in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Her eyes were still good. Her hands were still steady. She announced plans for a comeback. She was going to star in a feature-length silent film about her own life. She drew large crowds at exhibitions in Massachusetts, New York, and other major cities. And then, in late 1922, the car accident. Annie and Frank were traveling in Florida when their automobile was involved in a serious crash. Annie's right leg was severely injured. She was required to wear a steel brace for the rest of her life. The brace did not stop her. After more than a year of recovery, she returned to the range in 1924 and set records at the age of 64. But her body had been signaling for some time. By 1925, she was frail and in poor health. She and Frank moved back to her hometown area in Ohio to be near family. They attended local shooting matches. Annie began writing her memoirs, serialized in newspapers across the country. She did not finish the memoir. On November 3, 1926, Annie Oakley died of pernicious anemia in Greenville, Ohio. She was 66 years old. She had been married to Frank Butler for 50 years. Frank was in Michigan at the time, staying with Annie's younger sister, Huldah Haynes, in Ferndale. By at least one account, he stopped eating when he learned of Annie's death and died 18 days later, on November 21, 1926. One biographer reported malnutrition and starvation as the cause. According to another biographical source, his death certificate listed his cause of death as senility. He was 79 years old. His body was shipped back to Ohio. Annie was cremated. Her ashes were placed, according to one persistent account, inside one of her shooting trophies, which was then laid inside Frank Butler's coffin. Both body and ashes were interred at Brock Cemetery near Greenville, Ohio, on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1926, 51 years, almost to the day, after the Thanksgiving in 1875, on which she may or may not have first shot against Frank Butler in Cincinnati. Her incomplete autobiography was given to the stage comedian Fred Stone. When the papers were opened, it was discovered that Annie Oakley's entire fortune, the earnings of the most famous female performer of her generation, had been spent on her family and on her charities. There was no stash of gold. There was no savings account. There was a pile of letters from grateful strangers, and there were receipts from orphanages, and there was a record of quiet giving that had lasted decades. She left the world with empty pockets and a good name. To understand the full weight of what Annie Oakley accomplished, it helps to step back from the beats of her biography and to look at the world she was navigating. Consider first what it actually took to shoot the way she shot. The firearms of the 1870s and 1880s were not the precision instruments of a modern competition shooter. The rifles Annie used most often in her exhibition career were lever-action repeaters from makers like Marlin and Winchester, along with various single-shot and bolt-action arms that came and went as the technology of the period evolved. The ammunition was black powder in her early career, smokeless later. Every shot fired produced a cloud of smoke and a flash of burning powder and a concussive wave of noise. A shooter in a performance arena was working inside a haze that she herself had created, tracking moving targets through the drifting smoke of her own rifle and the rifles of the cowboys and sharpshooters working beside her. She had to compensate for all of it: humidity, temperature, wind when she was performing outdoors, the condition of a given barrel after 50 shots of black powder fouling, the weight of her own rifle as the hours of a long performance wore on her shoulders. She performed most seasons 6 days a week. At the height of the Wild West's popularity, she might have been on the stage 300 times in a year. Every performance involved dozens of live rounds. Over the course of a career, she fired, conservatively, millions of them. And she did it without a scope. Her rifles used iron sights. She lined up her eye with a small notch in the rear sight, centered a front blade in that notch, put the blade on the target, and pulled the trigger. She did this for glass balls thrown into the air and falling at various speeds and angles. She did it for coins flicked upward. She did it for playing cards spinning through the air. She did it for lit candles, whose flame had to be extinguished without the bullet striking the wax. She did it while shooting backwards, aiming over her shoulder using the reflection in a table knife or a hand mirror. She did it riding a horse at a full gallop, her rifle shouldered, her body rising and falling with the horse's stride. Frank Butler 20 paces away, throwing glass targets into the air. None of this was a trick in the sense of an illusion. There was no sleight of hand. The bullets were real. The targets were real. The hits were real. Thousands of people watched her, night after night, city after city, year after year, and what they saw was what was happening. No one has ever accused Annie Oakley of cheating. No one ever could. The evidence was too public and too consistent. What she had was, in part, a gift. That mysterious coordination of eye and hand that even the best teachers cannot install in someone who does not have it. But the gift was a small part of the total. The rest was work. Thousands of hours of practice, careful maintenance of her firearms, careful attention to her body. She refused to drink alcohol, she did not smoke, she ate simply, she slept in regular hours when she could. She understood what professional athletes of the 20th century would later come to understand, that performance depended on the boring discipline of every other hour of the day. She was, in short, a craftswoman of the highest order, and she was doing a craft that, in her time and place, was not supposed to belong to women. That last fact is worth dwelling on because it is where Annie Oakley made her largest mark on the world she left behind. In the 1870s, when Annie was a child learning to shoot, the near-universal assumption in American society was that firearms were not the business of women. Women shot, when they shot, under the supervision of a father or a husband for the purpose of defending a homestead from a narrowly defined set of threats. They did not, except in rare instances on the extreme frontier, compete with men. They did not perform publicly. They did not, certainly, earn their living with a rifle. By the time Annie was 30, she was doing all three, and she was doing it while wearing a dress of her own design, trimmed with embroidery she had sewn herself, curtsying to queens between sets, and maintaining a public demeanor so modest and so morally unimpeachable that even the most conservative critics of female public life could find nothing to complain about. She disarmed her critics by refusing to look like their caricature. She was not loud, she was not bawdy, she was not a woman trying to be a man. She was, by every measure, thoroughly a woman of her century, and she was out shooting every man in the building. This was a particular kind of quiet revolution. It did not announce itself. It did not issue manifestos. It did its work by showing. The women who came to her shows, and they came in extraordinary numbers, sometimes outnumbering the men, saw a person who looked like them, dressed like them, spoke like them, and who was doing something they had been told was impossible. They saw their own excuses wither. They saw possibilities for their daughters. Some of them wrote to her. Many of them brought their daughters to meet her afterward. Some of them bought their daughters rifles and asked Annie's advice on where to begin. This was how a revolution worked in the 19th century, in a country that did not yet know what to do with its women. It worked through demonstration, and Annie Oakley, who had never read a word of political theory, was the most persuasive demonstration of her time. It is also worth acknowledging, clearly and without softening, that the world Annie worked in was built on the subjugation of others. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was a show that made money by dramatizing the conquest of the American West, by restaging, for paying crowds, the attacks on wagon trains and stagecoaches that had been the stuff of the Indian Wars. It dramatized, in its finale and many seasons, an attack by native warriors on a settler's cabin, from which Buffalo Bill would arrive with his entourage of cowboys to rescue the family. It offered Europe and America a particular narrative about who had been the aggressor and who the defender on the Great Plains. That narrative was, to put it gently, not balanced. And yet, at the same time, the Wild West was one of the most significant employers of Native American performers in the late 19th century. It brought Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, and others onto a stage before a world audience, paid them, housed them, fed them, and gave them the opportunity to ride their horses and wear their regalia and, in a sense, present themselves to the world that had just defeated them. Cody, for his part, was public in his statement that every Indian outbreak he had ever known had resulted from broken promises and broken treaties by the government. He was, on balance, a man with more sympathy for native peoples than most of his white contemporaries. He was also, unavoidably, a man who made his fortune reenacting their defeat for a profit. Sitting Bull appeared with the show for only one season in 1885. He did not enjoy it. He was said to have been troubled by the poverty he saw in American cities and to have given much of his earnings away to the children who followed him in the street. He returned to the Standing Rock Reservation that winter. 5 years later, on December 15, 1890, he was killed by Lakota policemen of the Indian Service during an attempt to arrest him, part of the federal government's panicked response to the ghost dance religious movement, which Washington had convinced itself was a precursor to an uprising. 2 weeks after Sitting Bull's death, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, massacred more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children at Wounded Knee Creek. Annie Oakley heard of Sitting Bull's death while on tour. She grieved him. She had known him as a friend. She spoke of him with respect for the rest of her life, and she continued to perform in a show that, in its narrative bones, celebrated the civilization that had killed him. These are the contradictions of the era. They are not Annie's contradictions alone. They were every American's contradictions at the end of the 19th century, and they remain part of the inheritance of every American today. Annie's friendship with Sitting Bull was real. The machinery that crushed Sitting Bull was also real. Both things lived in her life at the same time. Her legacy is honest only when both are remembered. There is one more thing worth saying about Annie Oakley before we bring her story to its close. She refused to be small. She had every reason to have been small. She had grown up in poverty so acute it had driven her to the county infirmary. She had been beaten and starved by strangers for 2 years of her childhood. She had watched her mother widowed twice. She had entered a profession, public entertainment, that in the 19th century was widely regarded as a step away from disrepute for a woman. She had operated in a world in which women who dared to take up men's work were sneered at, hectored, and occasionally assaulted for their trouble. She had, at the height of her fame, been slandered in the pages of some of the largest newspapers in the country by one of the most powerful men in American publishing. At any point along that road, she could have let the world make her small. She could have receded. She could have stopped shooting. She could have settled into the domestic role that the 19th century would have approved for her. She could have let Hearst's lie stand rather than endure the humiliation of 6 years of lawsuits. She did none of those things. She got up every morning, put on a dress she had sewn, picked up her rifle, and went to work. When the world tried to cheat her, she went to court. When the world told her women should not shoot, she shot. When the world told her women should not offer to raise regiments, she offered. When the world told her a woman of 50 was too old to set records, she set records at 50, and 60, and 62, and, with a steel brace on her leg, at 64. She was not a woman who made a noise about her refusals. She just refused. This is what it looked like in the American 19th century for a woman of humble origins to simply decide that she was going to live at full size. It did not require political theory. It did not require movements or manifestos. It required a rifle, a steady hand, and a marriage to a man who recognized what he was married to and had the sense to step aside and hold her targets. And so we arrive at the question of what remains. The stage musical Annie, Get Your Gun opened on Broadway on May 16, 1946, 20 years after Annie's death. Ethel Merman played Annie. Ray Middleton played Frank Butler. The music was by Irving Berlin. It was, and remains, a great piece of musical theater. It is also, as a portrait of the real Annie and the real Frank, largely a fabrication. The show invented a rivalry between Annie and Frank, a competitive tension in which Annie had to learn to deliberately lose in order to keep her man. The signature song from that storyline, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better, is a brilliant piece of Broadway songwriting. It is also a slander on Frank Butler's memory. The real Frank Butler did not resent Annie's greater fame. He arranged it, he managed it, he promoted it. When she started to outshine him in the early 1880s, he had the emotional intelligence to see what was happening and the good sense to step out of her way. He spent the second half of his career holding targets for her, writing her press releases, handling her business, and going to bed next to her for nearly every night of 50 years. He was, by every account of every person who knew him, proud of her. The sick marriage staged in Annie, Get Your Gun never existed. Frank and Annie were, to use a word that rarely gets applied to people of their era, partners. The film versions followed. Barbara Stanwyck played her in 1935 in Annie Oakley. Betty Hutton played her in the 1950 film version of Annie, Get Your Gun. Geraldine Chaplin played her in Robert Altman's 1976 Buffalo Bill and the Indians. None of these performances is the real Annie. The real Annie was quieter, smaller, harder, and less theatrical than any of them. She did not belt Broadway songs. She did not feud with her husband. She did not spit and drawl. She spoke in the plain, direct cadence of a Quaker, Ohio farm girl, and she shot better than any of her screen portrayers could have dreamed. Her physical legacy is gathered today in the Garst Museum and the National Annie Oakley Center in Greenville, Ohio. A vast collection of her personal possessions, her performance memorabilia, and her firearms are on permanent exhibit there. A statue of her stands at the Annie Oakley Memorial Plaza in Greenville. A stretch of Ohio State Route 127 has been designated the Annie Oakley Memorial Pike. She has been inducted into the Trap Shooting Hall of Fame, the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame, the National Women's Hall of Fame, the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame, and the New Jersey Hall of Fame. The town of Greenville holds an Annie Oakley Days Festival every July. The Annie Oakley House in Cambridge, Maryland, the brick bungalow the Butlers built in 1913, is on the National Register of Historic Places. Her name, in ordinary English, remains a unit of meaning. A complimentary ticket in the theater business is still, sometimes, called an Annie Oakley. So is, in certain corners, a woman who shoots well, or a little girl with a surprising skill. She left her name to the language. Brock Cemetery, where her ashes lie with Frank Butler's body, is a small country graveyard outside Greenville. It is not a famous grave. Tourists who go looking for it tend to get lost. The stone is simple. Frank and Annie are buried together, as they asked to be. There is, by most accounts, no elaborate monument, no guarded enclosure. Just two people, husband and wife, lying in the Ohio ground under which she had hunted squirrels as a barefoot child. This was what fame cost her, and what fame gave her. It cost her the privacy that the farmer's daughter in her always craved. It gave her the power to reshape, by her own daily example, what a woman could be. The bargain was imperfect. The bargain always is. But she walked it on her own terms, from the Ohio woods to Windsor Castle to a simple grave in a country cemetery, and at no point along the road did she become someone other than herself. There is a photograph of her, taken in 1894 by D.F. Barry, that survives in the archives of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. She is 33 or 34. She is wearing a dark shirt with ornate embroidery. Her hair is long and loose. She is holding a rifle across her lap. She is not smiling. She is looking directly at the camera with an expression that is neither proud nor modest nor theatrical. It is the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is, who has done the work, and who has no more to say about it. That is the face of Annie Oakley. Remember her that way. Remember the girl who was born in a log cabin outside Woodland, Ohio, in the summer of 1860, to parents who could not have imagined the life she would live. Remember the 9-year-old who was dispatched to the poor farm because there was no other place for her. Remember the 11-year-old who ran from the house of the wolves with no shoes in the snow. Remember the 15-year-old who shot quail through the head to lift her mother's mortgage. Remember the young woman who walked onto a shooting line in Cincinnati and outshot a professional marksman who had expected to collect a $100 bet. Remember the wife who loved her husband for 50 years, and the sharpshooter who performed for Queen Victoria, and the marksman who taught 15,000 women to defend themselves, and the woman who sued Hearst 55 times to clear her name, and the 64-year-old in a steel leg brace who was still setting records. Remember that she did all of it without once giving up who she was, without once letting the world make her loud or crude or coarse or small, without once betraying Frank Butler or her mother or the plain speech and plainer dress of the Darke County Quakers who raised her. And remember finally that her story is not a story about shooting. It is a story about what one person, without advantages of birth or education or wealth or size, can do in a life if she refuses to accept that the world has already decided what she is worth. Phoebe Ann Mosey decided the world was wrong. She spent 66 years proving it. Before we leave her, though, there is more to be said, more that the outline of her biography, laid down as a chain of dates and cities, cannot by itself convey. The facts of Annie Oakley's life are remarkable enough, but some of what made her singular lies not in the facts themselves, but in the texture of how they were lived, and that texture is worth unwinding a little more slowly. Let us return for a moment to the matter of her shooting. The standard opening of Annie's turn in the Wild West arena was choreographed to look casual and rehearsed to the minute. The band would strike up a particular bar of music. The audience would quiet. A small woman in a fringed skirt and embroidered bodice would walk out from the performer's entrance, alone, carrying a rifle. She would curtsy to the grandstand. She would acknowledge the royal box or the presidential box or whatever box existed in a given arena. And then she would begin. The first targets were glass balls. Frank Butler, standing at a carefully measured distance, would throw them into the air one at a time. Annie would break them cleanly with successive shots from a lever-action rifle, working the lever between each report, feeding the gun as fast as the glass balls could be thrown. After the single balls came the doubles, 2 thrown at once, 1 for each barrel of a double-barreled shotgun, broken in mid-air before either hit the ground. After the doubles came the triples, and then the quadruples, and then, for a finale, 5 and 6 glass balls thrown at once. Then came the cards. A playing card, usually the ace of hearts, for visibility, would be tossed into the air. Annie would riddle it with bullets before it fell. The holes were real, and she kept the cards. She signed them afterward and handed them out as souvenirs at the edge of the arena. The ones that survive are scattered through private collections and museums, and if you examine them under glass, you can see the bullet holes, each one clean-edged and tightly placed, usually close enough together to be covered by the palm of a hand. Then came the candle. A lit candle was placed on a stand some paces away. Annie would raise her rifle and, without disturbing the wick, snuff the flame. The physics of this are harder than they look. The bullet does not have to strike the flame itself, which is only a brief envelope of ionized gas. The bullet has to pass close enough to the flame that its passing wave of air pressure extinguishes the flame without striking the wax beneath it. A miscalculation by 1/8 of an inch means the wax is destroyed, or the wick is knocked flying, and the shot looks clumsy. Annie, in the videos that survive of her performances in later life, almost never blew the wax. Then came the cigarette. Frank Butler, always frank, except on that one famous occasion in Berlin, would place a cigarette between his lips at a measured distance. The ash at the tip would be allowed to grow as Frank smoked it down for a moment. Annie would aim, she would fire. The ash would fall off the end of the cigarette, cut cleanly from the tobacco by the passing bullet. Frank did not flinch. He never flinched. He had done the shot thousands of times by the end of his career, and he had absolute trust in his wife, and his trust was never betrayed. Then came the horseback work. Annie would mount a horse brought out by the handlers. She would ride at a gallop around the perimeter of the arena, standing in the stirrups, or, in later performances, simply seated deep in the saddle. Frank would throw targets from a fixed position. Annie would engage them on the move. Glass balls, metal plates that rang when hit, stuffed cloth targets attached to spikes in the ground. The timing was everything. The horse's gait had to be predictable. The throws had to be timed to her position. A single miscalculation by horse or by thrower would throw the whole sequence off. The audience rarely saw a miss. And then, for certain performances, came the mirror trick. Annie would stand with her back to the target. Frank would position a small mirror or a knife polished on its back to a mirror shine, held in her hand or placed in front of her. She would look into the mirror, sight the target reflected in it, aim her rifle over her shoulder, and fire. The bullet would strike the target. She had, in a sense, developed a technique that allowed her to shoot behind herself. It was impossible, and she did it anyway. This was the act. Performed 6 nights a week, matinees on Saturdays, sometimes doubled up in the long evenings of European summers, across 17 years with the Wild West, and a subsequent decade with Young Buffalo and her own exhibitions. In the middle of all of it, she was also a wife and, by the standards of the late 19th century, a homemaker. Frank and Annie maintained households across the years in Cincinnati, in New York, in East Orange, in Nutley, in Cambridge, in Pinehurst, and finally in Ohio. When they were on the road, they traveled with a compact luggage arrangement of her own design. She did not trust the show's wardrobe managers with her costumes. She made her own, repaired her own, laundered her own, and packed her own. She kept her rifles and ammunition in a series of wooden cases she had personally ordered, lined with felt, locked. She unpacked them herself in every arena. She inspected every firearm before every performance. She cleaned them after. If you ever wondered why there is no record of Annie Oakley's rifles misfiring or jamming or producing the kind of embarrassing failure that punctuated the careers of many of her male contemporaries, this is why. She did her own gunsmithing. She knew her tools. She also wrote her own letters, dealt with her own correspondence, and, increasingly as the years went on, took on the role of informal mentor to young women who had set their hearts on a career of their own. Her correspondence files in the various archives that hold her papers contain dozens and dozens of letters from young women asking for advice, and Annie's replies. The replies are patient, specific, and often deeply practical. She tells one correspondent to practice with a smaller caliber rifle first before moving up to competition work. She tells another that her handwriting is poor and that she should practice her letters before she applies for a stage role. She tells another that she should think carefully before rushing into a marriage, and that the quality of a husband matters a great deal more than the ardency of a suitor. She was, in effect, running a one-woman advice bureau by mail for the better part of 40 years. She did not charge for it. She did not publish the letters. She simply answered them. And in the meantime, in the public imagination, a new kind of American figure was being created around her, almost without her conscious participation. The figure was the cowgirl. Before Annie Oakley, the word cowgirl scarcely existed in American English. There were ranchers' daughters. There were women who rode horses on frontier ranches, who roped cattle when the work needed doing, who carried rifles when the land required carrying one. But they had not coalesced in the national imagination into a recognizable type. They were scattered, unorganized, unwritten about. The Wild West changed that, and Annie Oakley, more than any other single performer, gave the new figure its face. The cowgirl, as she emerged through the posters and photographs of Annie Oakley's career, was not a masculine woman. She was not a woman dressed as a man. She was not a tomboy transgressing boundaries. She was something more subtle and, in its way, more radical. She was a woman who wore a skirt she had probably sewn herself, and who worked alongside men as their equal. She rode, she shot, she roped, she made her own living, she looked after her own business, and she did it without apologizing to anyone and without pretending to be what she was not. That image, Annie in her embroidered bodice and her knee-length split skirt, her long hair loose on her shoulders, her rifle held easily across her body, became, over the course of 2 decades of international touring, one of the most recognized visual templates in the world. It was reproduced on posters, on trade cards, on cigarette packs, on children's books, on product endorsements for everything from patent medicines to sewing machines. And a generation of American girls, looking at those posters in shop windows and in the pages of magazines, began to imagine themselves differently. Some of them did more than imagine. By the first decade of the 20th century, trick-riding cowgirls were appearing as regular attractions at rodeos from Wyoming to Oklahoma. Lucille Mulhall, who was born in 1885 and began performing at the age of 8, became famous as the first woman to rope and ride steers in public competition. Fannie Sperry Steele won the Women's Bucking Horse Championship at the Calgary Stampede in 1912. Prairie Rose Henderson, Bertha Blancett, Tilly Baldwin, the list of professional cowgirls who emerged from the rodeo culture of the 1900s and 1910s is long, and almost every one of them, when asked where they had first glimpsed the possibility of a life like the one they ended up living, named Annie Oakley. She had not set out to be a cultural template. She had set out to support her mother. She had set out to make a marriage work. She had set out to be, quite simply, the best shot in the country. But the consequences of what she had done were larger than her intentions. A nation of women had needed a different kind of example, and she, without asking to be one, became it. This is a pattern that recurs in the history of pioneering figures. The people who change what is possible are often not the ones who set out to change it. They are the ones who went about their own business with such singular focus and such unembarrassed competence that the people watching them had no choice but to update their expectations. Annie Oakley was a pioneer in exactly that sense. She did not argue for women's suffrage. though she wrote in one late letter that she could not understand why any sensible country would deny the vote to women who clearly could think. She did not march in parades, she did not lecture on platforms, she did not position herself as a symbol of anything. She simply shot, and shot, and shot. And because she shot so well, and for so long and so publicly, she taught the world, without ever making a speech, that the assumptions it had been making about women were wrong. The Nutley years, from 1892 to 1904, were the closest she came to a settled life. Nutley, New Jersey, in those years, was a small town of perhaps 5,000 people. It lay about 15 miles west of Midtown Manhattan, reachable by trolley and by train. It was not yet a suburb in the modern sense. It had farms, it had a main street with a general store, a post office, a blacksmith, a livery, and a newspaper. Annie and Frank settled there because it was convenient for travel. Cody's Wild West used New York as a staging point for tours, and Annie's side exhibitions often ran at Madison Square Garden and other Manhattan venues, but also because it was quiet. Nutley did not demand that Annie Oakley be Little Sure Shot. Nutley let her be Mrs. Butler. The neighbors remembered her later as a woman who kept to herself. She gardened, she raised her dogs, she wrote her letters. Frank was often with her in those years when the tour schedule allowed. They attended the local Episcopal church. Annie had drifted somewhat from the strict Quaker practice of her childhood, though the plainness of her manner remained Quaker to the end. They entertained visitors from the show, performers passing through New York, Cody himself when he was in town, Nate Salisbury, the theatrical manager, sometimes Black Elk or Long Wolf or other Lakota performers who were in the city between tours. They did not ever have children. It was a private grief that Annie did not talk about publicly. The biographers who have examined the question have found no record of a pregnancy, no record of a miscarriage, no clinical explanation in the surviving correspondence. She and Frank simply did not become parents. They loved their dogs. They doted on the children of the show's other performers. They sent money to orphanages. They made, out of what might have been a sorrow, a life of quiet generosity. It is perhaps because they had no children of their own that Annie Oakley's philanthropy during the Nutley years took the shape it did. She gave money anonymously. She paid for the schooling of children she had never met. She paid medical bills for women she had met only once. When her autobiography was posthumously opened and the records of her giving were examined, biographers found, scattered through the receipts, dozens of instances of this kind of quiet support. She had been funding strangers for decades. No one, during her lifetime, had known the full extent of it. There is one more piece of the story that deserves its proper weight, and it concerns the recovery from the train wreck of October 1901. When the freight locomotive struck the show train outside Lexington that autumn night, Annie Oakley was in her sleeping berth. The impact threw her violently. Her spine was injured in a way that, in the medical understanding of the time, was considered catastrophic. She was taken first to a local hospital and then transported north for more sophisticated care. Doctors told her that the paralysis in her legs might be permanent. They told Frank that his wife would not walk again. Annie did not accept it. She endured 5 spinal operations over the next year and a half. The surgeries of the early 1900s were crude by modern standards. Anesthesia was a dangerous gamble with ether or chloroform. Antiseptic technique had only recently become standard, and not every surgeon practiced it rigorously. Annie survived operations that killed many of her contemporaries, and during the periods of convalescence between them, she did something few patients of her era would have had the physical reserves to do. She rehabilitated herself. She did exercises in bed, small, painful movements of her legs and back, repeated for hours until she could do them a little better, then a little better, then a little better. She tried first to sit up without assistance, then to stand, then to walk with a cane, then, impossibly, to walk without one. By 1902, when the playwright wrote The Western Girl for her, she could stand on a stage for the duration of a performance. She was not what she had been. She would never again do the full galloping horseback work of her Wild West career. But she could shoot, and she could act, and she was back. There is a photograph of her from this period that is heartbreaking in its restraint. She is perhaps 42 years old. Her hair has begun to streak with gray. She is dressed in a simple high-collared dress. She is holding a rifle, not for a performance, just for the picture. And her expression is the expression of someone who has been through something she does not intend to discuss. The photograph does not ask for sympathy. It does not declaim. It is a woman, post-recovery, showing the camera that she is still here. She would go on, from that photograph, to more than 2 additional decades of active shooting. She would return to exhibitions. She would set records in her 50s and 60s. She would, at 62, hit 100 clay targets in a row. She would, after a devastating car accident at 62, come back in a steel leg brace and set additional records at 64. What do we call that quality? It is something deeper than stubbornness. It is a kind of refusal of the body's verdict. She did not accept bad news from the doctors in 1901. She did not accept the verdict of the car in 1922. She was going to keep shooting until her hands no longer worked, and when her hands finally stopped working, only then would she concede that she was done. Her hands stopped working in 1925. She died in 1926. One more thought as we close. There are 2 ways to remember a person. There is the statue way, the bronze figure on a pedestal, polished and heroic, removed from the complications of the life that was actually lived. Annie Oakley has been memorialized that way, in statuary and in the popular imagination, for nearly a century. And then there is the honest way. The way that includes the squirrel she shot through the head as a child because her family needed the meat. The way that includes the nameless family of abusers who put her out in the snow barefoot. The way that includes the difficult marriage to a divorced Irishman whose first divorce had not been finalized on the paperwork she insisted represented her wedding date. The way that includes the mild vanity about her own age that she maintained for 30 years. The way that includes her performing in a show that made its money by sanitizing the conquest of the plains, while her friend Sitting Bull, whom she loved, was killed by the federal government he had surrendered to. The way that includes the 6 years she spent in court against Hearst. The way that includes the 5 spinal operations. The way that includes the car accident, the steel leg brace, the pernicious anemia, and the grave in the country cemetery. The honest way is more interesting than the statue way. It always is. Annie Oakley was not a figure from a musical. She was not a cartoon. She was not the version of her that Ethel Merman played on Broadway or Betty Hutton played in Hollywood. She was a real woman in a real century who did real work under real conditions and who carried, in her mostly silent way, the full weight of every contradiction that her country was then failing to work out. And she shot in the middle of it all better than anyone had ever shot before. She shot through the century. She shot through the false names. She shot through the assumption that a woman could not. She shot through the Hearst Empire's attempt to soil her. She shot through her own injuries. She shot until her hands no longer worked, and when she put the rifle down, she had changed what a woman could be. What do you do when everything the world says about you is wrong? You load the rifle. You aim at the highest mark you can see, and you keep on aiming and keep on shooting because only practice will make you perfect. You aim at the high mark, she once said, and you will hit it. No, not the first time, not the second time, and maybe not the third, but keep on aiming and keep on shooting, Finally, you will hit the bullseye of success. She said that, and she meant it, and she lived it. And every woman and every girl who has ever picked up a rifle in this country since has done it in a world that Annie Oakley helped to make. More than that, every woman and every girl in this country who has simply taken up a skill the world told her she could not master, who has stood her ground against a prejudice older than she was, and whose only answer was to do the work better than anyone expected, has walked, in some measure, in the tracks Annie left behind her. She did not lecture the 19th century into updating itself. She simply made herself impossible to dismiss. The rest followed. It always does, eventually, for people who refuse to be dismissed. That is the real inheritance. That is what the farm girl from Darke County left us. If this story moved you, please leave a like so others can find it. Thank you for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.